Hello, everyone. How are you doing tonight? Glad you can join us. It's a lovely evening. I'm here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. We are continuing to ride out the storm that is America amidst a pandemic, 130,000 deaths, many millions infected. But you're still here, I'm still here, and it's July. And why not have a conversation? Why not spend your evening chatting with me? I'm glad you're all here. It's always a pleasure to interact with all of you. I will be following our usual format. Plenty of unnamed orange beverage. In addition to that, if you would like to tweet this out, that would be appreciated. If you would like to hit the like button, that would be appreciated. If you'd like to hit the subscribe button, that would be greatly appreciated. Make sure you hit the notifications bell so you find out every time we're going to do one of these, right? Build this community. Share this on your Facebook. Share this on your Reddit. Invite your friends to join us. Let's have a lovely, lovely conversation. I'm sure there are many of you that have things you want me to talk about. So, the best way to get me to talk about it is to shoot me a super chat. And our format for this evening will follow our usual format, in which I give my opening remarks, and then we do our roll call, and I shout out and shout out to everyone who's in the chat and call you all out as I see you. And then I'll start answering your super chats, and that will be our evening. So, if there's something you really want me to talk about, shoot me a super chat. I will write it down and address it during the super chat portion of the program. So welcome, everybody. I hope we're all settled in. And on that note, I will jump right into it. Folks, Donald Trump wants the schools to open again. He is adamant that the elementary schools and the high schools and the middle schools and the universities of this country be fully operational. No distance learning, no online learning, but all kids in class this fall. And why does Donald Trump want this? Well, it seems that he wants this because that will be a step in getting the whole economy moving once again. Parents will be taking their kids to school. Teachers will be going to school. Schools will once again be purchasing products. And it's a way to get the economy rolling again. I've many times indicated that there is a divide between the rich and the ultra-rich. And that the ultra-rich, like Amazon, like Walmart, they seem to be somewhat doing okay during this crisis. Meanwhile, there's a lot of lower-level capitalists who aren't doing so well. Hobby Lobby, for example, fracking companies. That this pandemic has particularly hit hard the capitalists who aren't part of that elite group, and that Donald Trump was very much elected, to serve a group of millionaires and billionaires who've always felt like they're locked out of the club. They're not in with the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, the Morgans. They're not in with Silicon Valley and the tech giants. They feel locked out. Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education, billionaire, but where does her money come from? It comes from Amway, from Tupperware parties, and of course her brother is Eric Prince of Blackwater, right? I referred to one of Donald Trump's biggest supporters, Bernie Marcus. And who is Bernie Marcus? Bernie Marcus is the owner of Home Depot, big Donald Trump supporter. We're talking about the Koch brothers, right? The Trump camp is those capitalists that feel locked out. They desperately want the economy to get going once again. So Donald Trump is doing that. Plus, Donald Trump is twisting the arms of the universities by saying that if universities don't open up, he will pull the visas of all the international students who are here on student visas. He will pull their visas. They won't be able to be in the United States and distance learn. And of course, he's highlighting the fact that Harvard and Yale and MIT, I believe Harvard and MIT have already sued the Trump administration. This is already in court. Harvard, Yale, and MIT, the elite schools of the United States, they have quite a bit of international students. And it's interesting. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was one of the main strategists of the Cold War, he talked about the value of the U.S. post-secondary educational system, or the university system, and how it was very, very valuable that students from all over the world went to Harvard, that students from all over the world went to Yale, that students from all over the world went to MIT, because those students would come here, they would become educated, they would have teachers that would teach them a Western ideology, teach them U.S. ideas, they would live in the United States, they'd fall in love with U.S. culture, and they would go back to their home countries as sympathizers with the United States, and that soft power value for the education institutions is quite large. The fact that people from all over the world go to Harvard and Yale and MIT and get their education in the United States and then go back to their home country, it has value for the United States in terms of soft power. And I think Trump is in a way drawing attention to what Steve Bannon raised, which is the fact that a lot of the people who go to Virginia Tech and a lot of the people who are getting very good educations in the United States are not from the United States. The United States education system is a joke. It's crumbling. Lowest test scores in the Western world. Awful educational system in so many ways. But that's okay because of brain drain, right? We can just import people from around the world. We don't have to invest in our population here. And if you go to the doctor in the United States, you're probably going to have a doctor from India or Russia or Pakistan or Brazil, countries where they do provide free education. And yeah, it's bad for the developing world because it drains them of all of their, skilled folks, their scientists, their engineers. But it's also bad for the United States because we can leave our educational system in shambles because we don't need to train our next generation to be intelligent. We don't need our next generation to be smart. We can just, suck the smart people up from the developing world. And this isn't to feed into anti-immigrant bigotry at all, right? I mean, these are not folks that are jumping over the border to get into the country. These are people that are brought into the country. And it's part of the setup that the United States established during the Cold War. When we were going to be, the homeland to the free world, that involved conducting brain drain. That involved bringing in people from all over the world and having our educational system, particularly our university system, function for an international purpose rather than a domestic one. And of course, our educational system is more, let me back up, our university educational system is more liberal in its outlook than most of the United States. And this is, I don't know if folks remember, this is a big, long-standing grudge of the conservatives. I remember David Horowitz. Do folks remember writing it down? Do folks remember David Horowitz? David Horowitz, he was originally the editor of Ramparts. He was like a young radical in the 1960s and 70s. His parents were members of the Communist Party USA. He was this well-connected radical newspaper editor in San Francisco. In the 80s, he became a neoconservative, and he launched a campaign against liberal professors in the first years of the 21st century, 2004, 2005, 2006. David Horowitz. David Horowitz made it his mission to fight against left-wing college professors. He profiled Grover Furr. He profiled Ward Churchill. He profiled a number of left-wing college professors and tried to mobilize the right wing and folks that watch Fox News against left-wing college professors. Effect on culture. He tried to mobilize them against left-wing college professors. And that was a pretty awful campaign. And if you read it, it was frustrating to watch because David Horowitz never really argued against anything that these professors said. It was basically, and this professor here says that the United States is imperialist. And this professor here says the United States has a history full of racism. And it was like, if you were already a conservative, you would get mad. But it was like never engaging with why these professors thought these left-wing things. Never engaging with what might drive the professors to say this. It was all just, this professor somewhere doesn't agree with you, is not a conservative. Doesn't that make you angry? And it was baiting. He was basically just baiting these college professors, right? This college professor said that the Vietnam War was unjustified. And again, never engaging with why they might think that, just, attacking college professors. And, that was David Horowitz. And he was the neocon. And I think the most successful campaign he waged was against Ward Churchill. Do folks remember Ward Churchill? Ward Churchill is a Native American scholar in Colorado. And after the 9/11 attacks, Ward Churchill wrote an essay, called Some People Push Back, in which he basically took a third worldist position. He basically argued that the World Trade Center victims were racist Euro settlers who deserved what they got. Not a good position. And so Bill O'Reilly and Fox News and David Horowitz just went after this guy relentlessly. For 100 days straight on the Bill O'Reilly show, they just went after Ward Churchill. They tried to fire him first for the essay. They said that was academic freedom. He's a tenured professor. He has freedom of speech. He can write what he wants. That didn't work. So then they tried to go after Ward Churchill, saying that he wasn't really Native American, saying that he had lied on his job application, that he wasn't really Native American. But he is a recognized member of a tribe, and it was very hard. I mean, they argued maybe his percentage wasn't high, but regardless, because he's a recognized member of a tribe, he was legally Native American, so they couldn't do that. So finally, they did go through everything that Ward Churchill wrote with a fine-tooth comb, and they got him for academic fraud. But the things they got him for were pretty flimsy. One of them was he cited an article that he ghost wrote for someone else, and he didn't include that in his footnotes. One of them was they argued that he cited a work of scholarship, and in his footnote misrepresented what that work said about a certain indigenous group. I mean, they just went through everything he ever wrote with a fine-tooth comb. Finally got him fired on that, and he actually won in court. He sued the University of Colorado for wrongful termination, and he won. So it was quite a show. And I remember I was in high school at the time, so I went and read David Horowitz's essay, Some People Push Back, and at that point I was, more third worldist and angry in my outlook, and so I sympathized with him. But what I didn't know, this is really wild, is that David Horowitz, I am not aware of the Coastal GasLink pipeline issue, so I can't answer your question, robot persona. I'm sorry, I'm not aware of that. David Horowitz, I'm sorry, not David Horowitz, Ward Churchill, interestingly has ties to the CIA, right? That he himself, despite being hated by David Horowitz, he himself had ties to the CIA. David Horowitz, why am I saying David Horowitz? Ward Churchill, right? He was very heavily involved in the Contra War in Nicaragua against the Sandinistas, right? Ward Churchill was the speechwriter for Russell Means. Russell Means was the leader of the American Indian Movement, AIM, and, the Sandinistas took power, 1979. Okay, Bolsonaro. All right, Bolsonaro, Lula. All right. Reestablishing itself in former Soviet spaces. All right. Movementism. Movementism. Absolutely. Great. So, Ward Churchill. He was a Native American activist. He was involved with the American Indian Movement. That was in the 1970s. There was this activist group called the American Indian Movement. And they were involved in a lot of militant action. You know, they seized government buildings, and they were very radical. They were kind of like the Black Panthers. They were inspired by the Black Panthers, but they were for Native Americans. Ward Churchill was involved with them. The leader of the American Indian Movement was a guy named Russell Means. So in 1979, there was a socialist revolution in Nicaragua, right? The Sandinistas came to power. So the CIA was trying to figure out how to fight the Sandinistas. And so they went and got Russell Means, the leader of the American Indian Movement, and sent him to Nicaragua to talk about how the Sandinistas were oppressing indigenous people. Anarcho-primitivism. And he did this. You know, he went to the Mosquito Coast, where there are a number of indigenous tribes, and made propaganda for the CIA about how the Sandinistas were oppressing indigenous people. And Ward Churchill even wrote essays justifying the fact that the indigenous groups of the Mosquito Coast were getting arms and weapons from the CIA. The CIA was arming indigenous groups in Nicaragua to fight the Sandinistas. And he wrote essays justifying working with the CIA, saying that Marxism was the main danger, and that the U.S. imperialists were the weakest danger. I mean, so Ward Churchill himself had ties to the CIA, but regardless, because he wrote all these quote-unquote anti-American things as the professor, the right wing went after him. That was David Horowitz. And, you know, he would set up a website called Discover the Networks that would, like, profile leftists, you know, and like, you know, try to criticize them. Purges. And that was David Horowitz. And again, it wasn't really based on arguing against these professors. Syndicalism. Wasn't really, you know, it wasn't really about saying these professors were wrong. It was just baiting them. Here's a professor who said something a conservative wouldn't like. That was basically all it was. I mean, he particularly targeted Bill Ayers, the former Weather Underground. Oh. Okay. You know, and he, you know, he just waged this campaign against liberal professors who were anti-American or something like that. And it didn't go over. I mean, they had an anti-Islamic hate week, and it didn't really go over. And, you know, they were able to make a lot of professors very, very nervous. A lot of professors put out in their classroom syllabuses that you had to not tape record the class because they feared, you know, seeing themselves on Fox News the next day. But it was just this right-wing campaign to try and intimidate college professors, make college professors nervous, make them afraid to say left-wing things in class. And it certainly had an impact. I mean, it made a lot of professors very afraid. I mean, Ward Churchill was probably the professor who suffered the most. But, you know, Grover Furr, I mean, they waged a campaign against Dr. Grover Furr, and he didn't go anywhere. He's still teaching. They waged a campaign against Bill Ayers, and I think they were able to, you know, when he retired, they were able to take emeritus status away from him, so he wouldn't be a professor emeritus. But, you know, he taught until he was ready to retire. He had really no problem there. You know, that they, you know, they went after left-wing professors. And I mean, it wasn't refuting things that they said. Thank you, Brent McKinney. It was just simply baiting them. If you were already a conservative, if you were already a Republican, you wouldn't agree with stuff, and it was saying, he says that. It was basically right-wing cancel culture. Basically. You know, you develop a dossier on somebody, they think all these things that you are not allowed to think. You're not allowed to think that Israel is bad. You're not allowed to think that the USA is not a land of freedom. You're not allowed to think the war on terror isn't justified. And you just bait somebody. You think a bunch of these things you're not allowed to think. And you don't argue with them. You just bait them. You just bait them. And you don't even have a real understanding of why they think that. You don't even know the context that they made these statements. You just make a dossier on somebody and then announce that they shouldn't be teaching at the university, that they're no good. You can't believe anything they say because they said this thing. It's right-wing cancel culture. And what's really wild is, the Wall Street Journal is this newspaper, daily newspaper here in the United States. It's written, it's owned at this point by the same people that own Fox News Corporation. And I glance through them because I find them more readable than the New York Times. The New York Times takes forever to make the point. It's so arrogant, and everyone who writes the New York Times thinks they're an amazing writer and all of this. News Corp just gives you, the Wall Street Journal just gives you straight up what you're supposed to believe. As I'm looking through the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal today, found this article, Bonfire of the Liberals. It's an official, this is not a private opinion. This is actually the Wall Street Journal op-ed. Bonfire of the Liberals. And you read it, and there's a whole lot wrong with this op-ed. But it's certainly interesting to people who follow, what we talk about on these lives. It's certainly got to be interesting to all of you. Let me read you the first paragraph of Bonfire of the Liberals from the Wall Street Journal. Quote, America's liberal intelligentsia thought that the election of Donald Trump would reenact 1984. But it's starting to look more like Homage to Catalonia, George Orwell's account of the left's internecine savagery during the Spanish Civil War. Witness the spectacular online meltdown that followed a liberal open letter opposing left-wing attacks on free speech. Okay, so let's back up. George Orwell, anti-communist, right-winger, fought in Spain with the Trotskyite militia called POUM, wrote a book basically blaming the Soviet Union for the fall of the Spanish Republic. Right. And they're basically saying that what's going on the college campuses now and this open letter opposing left-wing attacks on free speech is similar to Homage to Catalonia. Now, Homage to Catalonia describes the Trotskyites taking up arms against the Spanish Republic. Landlords, how does China deal with them? All right. And, the Spanish Republic and the Communist Party of Spain putting down this Trotskyite uprising. That's Homage to Catalonia. It's definitely not about people on the internet getting mad about a letter signed by somebody. So that's pretty outrageous that comparison is even being made. But regardless, I guess the issue is, on Tuesday, a letter on justice and open debate was published. Now, I don't know if folks are familiar with this, but Noam Chomsky and Jennifer Finney Boylan and a number of liberal kind of people signed a letter basically opposing cancel culture. The letter said, quote, editors are being fired for running controversial pieces. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Journalists are being barred from writing on certain topics, and professors are being investigated for quoting works of literature in class. It was signed by 150 writers and academics, basically warning about the dangers of cancel culture, right? That, if you write an article criticizing the Me Too movement or just interviewing somebody who criticizes the Me Too movement, you can lose your job. They talked about, J.K. Rowling. She said things about the transgender issue that people don't like, and people are ready to, destroy her over this, right? And so Noam Chomsky and a lot of people signed this statement. And of course, the response to this statement is, how dare you? How dare you sign it? And already, like Jennifer Finney Boylan of the New York Times has apologized for signing this statement. But what's weird is I look at this like cancel culture, and I see the same stuff that I saw with David Horowitz. Right? If you don't agree with J.K. Rowling about transgender issues, here's an idea. Argue with her. If you don't agree with, anybody. If you don't agree with the position that some people take about Syria, argue with them. But this atmosphere has been created where it's the same as David Horowitz. You're anti-American. And with these people, you're transphobic. You gave a platform to a person that I disagree with. Okay. Me Too in China. Marijuana. And it, again, never is it, we'll argue with these people. It's how dare they? They broke a rule by taking a position that we don't agree with, by giving a platform to a position that we don't agree with. So therefore, this person must be silenced. How dare they? It's very, 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 very scary. And again, there's not a lot of depth there. And I continue to encounter people who will call themselves socialists or communists or anarchists. But the more you get to know them, the more you realize they don't really understand socialism. They don't really understand communism. They don't really understand anarchism. They just have a list. They really don't like the right wing. And they have a list of rules in their head of things right-wingers say that therefore anyone who says it is right-wing. And they don't even quite fully understand, what these things are that they're not allowed to say. For example, I've talked a lot about the Congress for Cultural Freedom and how there was a lot of covert CIA funding to leftist groups, as a way to turn them against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And there are people who you say, hey, there was a lot of CIA funding for the art of Jackson Pollock and for the Trotskyite anti-communist, and they immediately go, that's a Nazi conspiracy theory. That's cultural Marxism, Nazi conspiracy theory. And it's like, no, it's not. Slow down. Hold your horses here. The people on the right wing, first of all, they never blame it on the CIA. Number two, they think it's actually Marxism. It's not Marxism. Three, I'm arguing Marxism is good, and I'm arguing that what the state covertly supported was not Marxism. Hold your horses. But they don't really want to think about these things with any depth. They have a rule in their head that anyone who says anything that sounds like quote-unquote cultural Marxism, silence them, and don't investigate what actually happened. Don't engage with it. And even if they're saying something that's completely different, it sounds nothing like that, silence them! Silence them! And you're just like, hold up, I'm just, No, they have rule in brain that says, thou shalt not think anything about cultural Marxism. And it's like, you're not saying what the right wing is saying. You're alluding to what is now a historical fact. The CIA brags about it on their website. It's one of the most successful programs. No, I have rule in my head. This is bad thing. This like Trump. This like Trump. And it's like, whoa, right? Another thing. If you say that, hey, Syria, not a good policy there. We shouldn't be arming terrorists and Al-Qaeda, and we shouldn't be trying to overthrow the Syrian government. Islamophobic! You sound like Trump! This sounds like Trump! Oh, Russia! This is rule in my head says must not think this way! And you're just like, whoa, I'm not talking about Trump. I'm just saying that maybe we shouldn't be arming the people who go on to join ISIS and trying to violently overthrow the Syrian government. Nope, I have rule in my head says not able to think this. And it's like, whoa, right? And that these people have just they're not really leftists. They're just people that have been brainwashed to hate the right wing. Well, I hate the right wing. I grew up around the right wing. The neoconservative right wing, the religious right, nobody annoys me more than those people. But these people, I don't even think they even know what the right wing even says. I don't even think they know with any depth what the right wing even believes. They just have watched a lot of Rachel Maddow, they know what you're allowed to believe and what you're not allowed to believe. If you question anything about any of the anti-Russian stuff, that Russia, quote unquote, rigged the election for Trump, and if you question that, Trump bad, Russia, Trump bad, I in my brain not allowed to think, and it's like there's no depth to their discussion. These people have no fucking clue what they're talking about. They just have a list of rules in their head, and if you break those rules, you are evil. And that's it. That's all they've got. And, some of them, they've memorized one or two things. Well, socialism is like worker cooperatives. It's like if every employee has a share of stock, that's socialism. So, yeah, that's Marxism, but everything else is just as bad as Hitler. And they say all this. These people are not Marxists. They're not leftists. And it's kind of shocking. It's kind of shocking. And again, should Noam Chomsky be canceled because he signed this letter? Seriously, should Noam Chomsky be canceled for writing a letter saying that maybe editors shouldn't be fired for running a controversial opinion? Should professors be investigated for quoting works of literature in class? Should journalists be barred from writing on certain topics? No. Right? And that's supposed to be what's so evil about quote unquote Stalinism, right? That's what's supposed to be so evil about tankies, is that we don't believe in freedom, right? We admire regimes that silence people, but these people are silencing people. In fact, one of the things you're not allowed to be is a tankie. And they can't ever tell you what a tankie is, right? Because Noam Chomsky, defended Pol Pot, so, is he a tankie? Well, no, you can talk about it. Noam Chomsky, all the people that they admire, Langston Hughes, for example, famous African-American poet, the Black Panthers who waved Mao's Red Book around and quoted Mao and sent delegations to North Korea and had good relations with North Korea and with Gaddafi, okay, well, that does, it's like they can't even tell you what a tankie is. Basically, if someone is famous and popular in U.S. society, they must not be a tankie, because tankies are bad. And, and they can't even tell you what a tankie is, but it's just something you're not allowed to be. And these people have no real ability to think. They have a list of rules in their head, and they defend them, and in this childish way, and they don't even understand what the rules are. They don't understand what the rules are. They don't even know. You talk to these people, they don't even know what it is. They know something that kind of sounds like something. They don't even know. They don't even know. And when you press them and try to get them to explain these rules that they have in their head that everyone must follow or they're canceled, they can't explain them. And it's kind of sad. Thank you, John. And it's kind of sad. And it should be frustrating. Folks, I'm finishing up. I've already written. I'm revising and editing and getting prepared to publish my book on the synthetic left. The upcoming book, the title is The Synthetic Left: How the CIA Ruined Socialism and What to Do About It. Ruined American socialism, rather, and what to do about it. And there's one individual who is like Mr. Synthetic Left. He is this guy who just keeps coming up over and over and over again. And he's very, very influential all throughout the United States. You wouldn't know about this guy. He's not a household name. He's got a Wikipedia page. It's small. But this guy, if you want to talk about synthetic left, if you want to talk about left that's covertly supported by the CIA, anti-communist, pro-imperialist leftism, the man who is at the center of all of this is Max Schachtman. Max Schachtman. I'm going to tell you about Max Schachtman. So Max Schachtman, he was an intellectual in New York City. He was a socialist, and he joined the Communist Party when it was formed. He was a member of the Communist Party. He was part of the International Labor Defense, which tried to free class war prisoners. That was Max Schachtman. What should I do? Oh. So Max Schachtman. He joined the Communist Party, became the leader of the International Labor Defenders. He was a Trotskyist, and he was one of the main leaders of the Trotskyite faction of the Communist Party that was kicked out in 1928. He was a leader of American Trotskyism, along with Martin Aburn and James Cannon. Max Schachtman was one of the main leaders of American Trotskyism. But then in 1939 was the year that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. The non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany was signed in 1939. There's actually a stupid song to the tune of My Darling Clementine that Trotskyites used to sing about it, and I'll sing it for you. Up in Moscow, in the Kremlin, in the fall of 39, there's a Russian and a Prussian riding up the party line. Leon Trotsky was a Nazi. Oh, we knew that for a fact. Pravda said it. We all read it until the Stalin-Hitler pact. Now old Trotsky, once a Nazi, that was then the party line. But now the Nazis are hotsy-totsy. Trotsky's setting British minds. It was a stupid song. They taunted the Communist Party with, it was, in 1939, the Soviet Union had gone to every other country, right? They'd gone to the United States, they'd gone to Britain, they'd gone to France, and France had briefly signed an agreement with the Soviet Union and then cut it off. But they saw the Nazis building up and preparing to attack them, and they wanted to form an anti-fascist global united front, and the Western countries weren't going to do it with them. And then they saw the Spanish Republic, right, fall, and Franco, pro-fascist Franco, take victory in Spain. So based on that, the Soviet Union made the decision to sign a non-aggression pact with Hitler, and they drew a line down Europe, and it was basically the armies of Germany will not cross one side of this line, and the armies of the Soviet Union will not cross another side of this line. And that was it. It was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. And it was the Soviet General Molotov and the Nazi General Ribbentrop. They signed the pact. And immediately, the U.S. media started demonizing the Soviet Union. They signed a pact with Hitler. They're collaborating with the Nazis. They say they're anti-fascist. They're hypocrites, blah, blah, blah. Right? So the Trotskyists had to discuss this. And Leon Trotsky, I'm sorry, was there a super chat I just missed? Does someone want to repeat it from Joe the Red? I'll write it down. What was it? What was the super chat, folks? I think I missed it. What was it? Co-ops are not socialist. Got it. Okay. So, 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. And the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was something that Trotsky actually kind of sort of defended. He condemned the Soviet Union for how they did it. He said that they did it in an unprincipled way, but he defended the Soviet Union's right to sign a pact with Nazi Germany. However, a lot of Trotsky's followers did not agree with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and among them was Max Schachtman. Max Schachtman was a leader of the New York City Trotskyists, the New York City Socialist Workers' Party, and in 1939, they split, and Trotsky said that the Soviet Union was a deformed workers' state, and James Cannon and the American Socialist Workers' Party agreed with him, but Martin Aburn and Max Schachtman and James Burnham, three well-known Trotskyite intellectuals, said that the Soviet Union was either state capitalist or the Soviet Union was bureaucratic collectivism. So as a group, they resigned from the Socialist Workers' Party, and they broke with Trotsky, and they formed what from that point on was called Third Camp Trotskyism. All right, that Trotsky maintained there were two class camps. There was the Soviet Union, the deformed workers' state, and there was the Western capitalist system. Well, Max Schachtman and Martin Aburn and James Burnham and the New York intellectuals, there's a very good book called The New York Intellectuals that talks about these people. They they broke with the Fourth International and with Trotskyism over this, arguing that they represented a third camp, that the Soviet Union and the United States, neither of them were working class, and that they were third camp Trotskyists. And Max Schachtman was the leader of third camp Trotskyism in the United States. And after World War II, almost immediately, Max Schachtman's people start working with the CIA. For example, Irving Kristol. Irving Kristol was a member of the Max Schachtman group. He was the man they hired to run the Congress for Cultural Freedom organization. He was a leader of the Trotskyist, Schachtmanite, International Independent Socialist League and the Workers' Party and whatnot. They immediately hired him. He ran the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And yes, his son is Bill Kristol, editor of the Weekly Standard. Irving Kristol went on to become the father of neoconservatism. But in the 1950s, he still pretended to be a leftist and was a Schachtmanite, and he was working with the CIA to run the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Irving Howe. Now, Irving Howe was a big member of the Schachtman group. And Irving Howe, he became a very, very prominent socialist intellectual in the United States. He wrote op-eds for the New York Times, and he eventually became one of the big founders of Democratic Socialists of America, Irving Howe. And Irving Howe was a follower of Max Schachtman, and he wrote for Partisan Review, the CIA-funded magazine. That's how he got his start, is the CIA-funded magazine, Partisan Review, started publishing his writings. You can talk about Mary McCarthy. Mary McCarthy was another, follower of Max Schachtman, a third camp Trotskyist. Disaster Global South. Was another third camp Trotskyist who was getting, who was being printed in Partisan Review, the CIA-funded magazine. Sane Freeze, which was this group that advocated, better cooperation between the USA and the Soviet Union, kind of a nuclear non-proliferation group. Again, it's all staffed by followers of Max Schachtman. The ISO, now they're not around anymore, but people may know the International Socialist Organization. For a long time, this was like the biggest Trotskyist group in the United States, the ISO, right? They were one of the biggest Trotskyist groups in the United States. Well, if you look at their history, they started out as the Independent Socialist Club of Berkeley. And that was Max Schachtman's group on the Berkeley campus. Now, when Schachtman denounced Leninism, they cut ties to Max Schachtman and started following Tony Cliff in Europe. Stalin and Trotsky's murder? Okay. And they started following Tony Cliff. But their origins are with Max Schachtman, and that's the ISO. They had the Socialist Worker. They were one of the biggest groups on the campuses. Haymarket Books is their subsidiary. They've become a faction within Democratic Socialists of America, but they started out as linked to Mr. CIA, Max Schachtman. Sidney Hook, a very prominent, college professor, was also employed by the CIA, by their Congress for Cultural Freedom program, also tied to Max Schachtman. The AFL-CIO. Now, you have to remember, the AFL-CIO is a labor union, right? I mean, there was the American Federation of Labor, which was the original labor union. Then there was the CIO. They eventually merged. Well, during the 1950s, the AFL-CIO started working. They set up something called the Solidarity House, and they started running an international network of anti-communist trade unions. And around that time, Max Schachtman became an official advisor to George Meany, who was the head of the international trade union of the AFL-CIO. The head of the AFL-CIO was George Meany. Max Schachtman, this third camp Trotskyist with all kinds of ties to the CIA, he became a personal advisor to George Meany. Who else was involved with the AFL-CIO during that time was Jay Lovestone. Jay Lovestone had been the leader of the Communist Party USA. He'd been kicked out for American exceptionalism. That's where the term comes. I'm not going to answer that. I'm not going to talk about that. So I can't even click any links, and I'm not going to talk about people like that who lie. So, you know, and that was that. So Jay Lovestone, I mean, you read about Max Schachtman. Max Schachtman is like Mr. Synthetic Lab, but no one's ever heard of this guy. What's interesting is Michael Harrington, who was the founder of Democratic Socialism of America. He's like, you know, probably, you know, this is the guy who wrote The Other America, which was a study of poverty in the United States. You know, and he served, I believe, in the Johnson administration and the Kennedy administration. You know, I mean, Michael Harrington, if you read his book Socialism, it's dedicated to Max Schachtman. And a lot of the neocons, right? I talked about Irving Kristol and his ties to Max Schachtman. But a number of neocons had direct ties to Max Schachtman. Max Schachtman was a very, very prominent, influential person, right? People in the Bush administration had ties to Max Schachtman. Right? People like Paul Wolfowitz had ties to Max Schachtman. I mean, this was a guy who called himself, you know, who called himself a socialist, called himself a Trotskyist, was working with the CIA, and, you know, I mean, was a very pivotal figure. Many of the neocons had links to him. Many of the leaders of the current, you know, DSA, Social Democratic Left, had links to this guy. Max Schachtman. No one ever talks about Max Schachtman. He was a very, very prominent figure. What's also interesting is that Max Schachtman, you know, he became very, very pro-U.S. military intervention. He supported the Bay of Pigs invasion. He opposed withdrawal from Vietnam. And in the final years of his life, he was to the right of most Americans when it came to foreign policy. Most Americans felt like the Vietnam War was not necessary. Most Americans felt like it wasn't necessary to do the Bay of Pigs invasion. But the Schachtmanites, in the name of being anti-Stalin and anti-Soviet Union, on the basis of that, you know, they were more hawkish, more pro-U.S. interventionism than most Americans were. Your typical non-Marxist American liberal was less in favor of war against the Soviet Union than the followers of Max Schachtman were. These Trotskyists were more anti-communist than average Americans were. These folks were straight-up interventionists. Right? That Stalinism, as they called it, was so evil that it was necessary to work with American imperialism. And it, you know, you read Irving Howe. He basically says that that socialists are part of the Western system. That they have nothing. They have more in common with the Western system than with Stalinism. I mean, these folks are basically announcing that they are in favor of Western imperialism, and you know, they're still socialists. They're still kind of Trotskyists, but they're in favor of Western imperialism. And a lot of the neocons come out of it because they think the Democrats. That's the thing. Irving Kristol, right? A lot of these folks, they think that the Democrats are too soft on the Soviet Union. So in the 80s, a lot of these former followers of Max Schachtman end up joining the Republican Party and becoming neocons. You know, Jay Lovestone, from what I understand, even worked in the Reagan White House. So these are folks that started out as communists, didn't like the Soviet Union, didn't like Stalin, cut ties with Trotsky because he wasn't anti-Soviet enough for them, and eventually became straight up neocons. And in fact, it's even in the Wall Street Journal. The article I was just reading to you ends with, in the 1970s, a handful of intellectuals, appalled by the left's viciousness and anti-Americanism, became neoconservatives and helped usher in a decade of better governance. Oh boy, right? Maybe their conditions will soon be right for something similar to happen again. You know, the Wall Street Journal is hailing the fact that a bunch of trots became neocons. There was a pipeline. Nowadays, we talk about the new atheist to alt-right pipeline. Well, back then, there was the Trotskyite to neocon pipeline. And that basically, synthetic leftism leads to rabid interventionism. Right? These people started getting support from the CIA in the name of trying to pull socialists and communists away from Marxism and away from the Communist Party. But these folks ended up becoming more in favor of interventionism than most liberals. I mean, it's bizarre. But then, folks, when you talk about synthetic leftism, what does all synthetic leftism have in common? What is the common thread in all of this? What brings the fake left together? All these groups that work for imperialism, that think that Western capitalism, imperialism is a good thing, and that when regime change operations are conducted by Western capitalism, it's a good thing. These folks that think that Marxism, Leninism is the same as Nazism. These folks that want to outlaw anybody, and silence anyone who speaks in support of better relations with Russia and China. What brings them all together? How do they get to that conclusion? What brings them all together? Well, folks, I'm going to give you the answer, and the answer is going to come from a place that what you would think has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Nothing to do with what we're talking about. This has nothing to do with what we're talking about, right? This sounds wacky. There's a religious group from South Korea called the Moonies. Have folks ever heard of them? Wacky religious group from South Korea. They believe that this man named the Reverend Sun Myung Moon is the second coming of Jesus. He's the new Messiah. He picks your spouse for you. It's been revealed, it's well documented, that the Moonies were started by Korean intelligence, that they had ties to the American intelligence agencies. They were an anti-communist operation. A very strange religious group. They were big in the 1970s. They were imported into the United States in 1972, and they were big supporters of Richard Nixon when Richard Nixon was being impeached. They starved themselves. They owned the New Yorker Hotel in New York City. They owned the Washington Times, which is the main right-wing newspaper in Washington, D.C. It's a strange religious group from Korea, Bolivia. Right, Bolivia. We'll talk about Bolivia. And they're like the most anti-communist folks you would ever meet. They actually had a front group for a long time called Causa International. They were very key in like the public relations campaign supporting the Contra War in Nicaragua against the Sandinistas. There was a friend of mine, actually, who was a communist that I knew, and her brother joined the Moonies. And when he joined the Moonies, he sent her a letter in the mail that said, "I will never speak to you again, and if I ever see you again, it will be on the battlefields of Armageddon, and I will kill you because you are a communist and you are my enemy. You're an enemy of Jesus Christ and Reverend Moon." I mean, they were this wacky, extreme right-wing group. Like in the 1980s, they used to go and rip down all the posters for anti-war rallies. They would just be dispatched all over Washington, D.C. and New York City to rip down posters for anti-war rallies. They actually, the leader of the group, Reverend Sun Myung Moon, owns arms munitions factories in South Korea. He owns factories that make M16 rifles and guns in South Korea. It's the Unification Church, the Unification Movement. They have a lot of different names. They have a million front groups. So you would think this group has nothing to do with the synthetic left, right? They're obviously right-wing. They're a wacky religious group, very anti-gay, very, anti-communist. Well, get a load of this. This is their, manifesto. This is Reverend Moon's, manifesto, the divine principle. This is his statement of principles. This is what they believe, right? The Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity. This is Reverend Moon's, updated Bible, what he believes. Let me read you something. This is from page 341 of Reverend Sun Myung Moon, of his manifesto, of his holy book, The Divine Principle. Quote, "It's natural for the satanic realm, which reached its apogee in communism, to support socialism. This is because Satan always attempts to realize in advance of God a defective imitation of the divine plan. God's plan is to develop a socialist economy, although with a form and content utterly different than state socialism and communism. According to God's ideal creation, God confers upon each individual the same value." Blah, 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 blah. He goes on. They're Trotskyites. The Moonies are Trotskyites. Did you hear me? The Moonies are Trotskyites. This is Jacobin magazine. They don't want state socialism. They want real socialism. The Moonies could write for effing Jacobin. Reverend Sun Myung Moon could have gotten a job at fucking Jacobin, folks. And this is what brings them all together. This is what brings them all together. From Reverend Sun Myung Moon to Max Schachtman to the ISO to jack-offs on the internet. This is what brings them all together. This is what brings them all together. Socialism is this magical fantasy land in their head. It's not anything that has ever existed. That's what brings them all together. Real socialism, bad. That's what brings them all together. I mean, that's what they think. Real socialism, bad. There's an anti-communist book from the 1950s called The God That Failed. You can look it up. There's a lot of ex-communists. Arthur Kessler, Richard Wright. And they write, and it's called The God That Failed. And the message is that communism promises heaven on earth, and the Soviet Union is not heaven on earth, therefore hate the Reds, therefore hate the commies. I mean, that's what brings all these people together. Real socialism, bad. Real socialism, bad. That's not real social. It brings all these people together. And they do this leap in their mind, where it's like the USSR, China, Cuba, Vietnam, these countries are not really socialism. So that makes them somehow more dangerous. That's basically what they argue, that because it's not real socialism, it's more dangerous than capitalism. It's fake, socialism that they think is not real socialism is somehow more dangerous than capitalism. You would think that these people would be principled. You'd think that they'd say, okay, well, I don't agree with the Soviet Union, but obviously I'm against capitalism more than I'm against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is maybe a little bit closer to what I believe. No. Somehow, socialism that actually exists in the world is more dangerous than Western capitalism and imperialism. They come to that conclusion. And based on that, they become agents of empire. It reminds you actually of the Gang of Four, right? In the 1970s, the Gang of Four in China came to the conclusion that the Soviet Union was, quote, the main danger. And it was on that basis that China established relations with Pinochet. It was on that basis that Richard Nixon went to China and was welcomed as a hero, right? That the Gang of Four made this great discovery that the fake socialist Soviet Union was more dangerous than Western imperialism. And so based on that, they aligned with imperialism. And this is what these people get. They don't seem to understand. Deep down, they really don't believe that Western imperialism is the problem. They think Western capitalism has bad policies. They think Western capitalism made mistakes. They don't really seem to understand that the order of the world centered around Washington and London and Wall Street, where big bankers keep the world poor, they don't seem to understand that that's a problem. They think it was a bad policy. Oh, sure, we made a mistake killing all the Native Americans. Sure, we made a mistake, with slavery. Sure, we made a mistake in Vietnam. Sure, we made a mistake in Korea. But, I mean, we have more freedom here to you know, say what we want on the internet than they do in other countries. So really, we're better than all those other countries. And that's really what they think. At deep down, they don't really believe that the Western capitalist system that says greed is good, that says that profits should come before people, that says that human beings don't have intrinsic value, where the economy functions according to profits, where countries around the world are beaten down and impoverished so that Wall Street corporations can maintain a monopoly. They don't really believe that system is evil. They don't really think that system is evil. They don't. They don't think that system is evil. And they don't even understand why it's evil. Right? In their minds, there might be problems with the system over here, but the problems with the system over there is even worse. So, yeah, that's where these people are at. That's where these people go. They don't really believe that Western imperialism and Western capitalism is the enemy. They don't really believe that the capitalist system of the West is the main thing holding back humanity. And they don't understand that the only reason China has lifted itself out of poverty is because it broke out of that system. They don't understand that the reason that Russia, you know, is now an industrialized country is because it broke out of that system. They don't understand that Africa, so much of Africa has been kept poor by that system, that millions of people die every day because of that system. They don't understand that millions of people can no longer live in their homelands because of that system. They don't understand that corpses continue to show up every day along the Mexican border because of that system. They don't understand that millions of people have died of opioids because of that system. They don't understand that right now our water is not being purified because of that system. They don't understand that. No, it's just a bad policy over here. Western capitalism is just a bad policy, but what's going on over there, that's even worse policy. They don't seem to understand that it is the system of profits and command that is driving humanity toward a cliff. And if we don't turn the car around really fast, we're going to go over the edge. They don't understand that. They just don't understand that. They just can't bring themselves to understand that. They just cannot bring themselves to understand that. But they're kind of mildly interested in socialist and left ideas. But clearly they're not like any country around the world that would develop socialism. No. That's the synthetic left, folks. That is the synthetic left. They want something completely different. Completely different. Completely different. What those of us who really understand Marxism want is we want the banks and the factories and the major industries to be organized to serve public good and not profits. We want the economy to be rationally organized to serve the people. We don't want profits in command. We want the countries around the world that have been kept chronically poor by Western capitalism to start to lift themselves up. We want the United States and the areas of the United States that have been deindustrialized and are falling apart to be raised up. We want people to have jobs and education and healthcare. We want the population to be mobilized to build and construct. We want an optimistic view of the future. We want people to feel good about having children. We want people to feel good about tomorrow. We want people to be filled with optimism. We want to get rid of racism and bigotry. We want to get rid of destructiveness. We want to give people hope. That's what we want. I don't know what these people want. But they want to overthrow regimes that bother them, that they read about in the New York Times. They want to cancel people. They want cancel culture. I don't know what these people want. But it sure as hell isn't what Marx wanted. It sure as hell isn't what Lenin wanted. It's not the rejection of Western capitalism and imperialism, that's for sure. So put that in your pipe and smoke it, folks. Ugh. For some reason, I'm in a drowsy mood. Ugh. Sorry about that. But yeah, that will be your opening ramble. So on that note, folks, why don't I do the roll call, and then I'll answer your super chats. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who's with me today? Names and locations. Australia, Oz whistles. Sami Jabber, UK. Jake Phillips, Germany. Texas, Pennsylvania, Germany, George Kraft in Texas, Sami in the UK, Orange City, Iowa, South Korea, Bristol, Wisconsin, Vallejo, California, Pennsylvania, Benjamin Zenovich, John Jones in Texas, Joe Gale East, Central New York, Jimmy, South Carolina, Dust James, Belfast, Joseph, Alex Ambiguous, Palawan, Philippines, Ontario, Binghamton, New York, Galen, North Carolina, David in Italy, Calvin Taylor, Florida, East Rockaway, New York, Joe Gale, Joe the Red, Alex in Salem, Oregon, Alex Giovanni. Who else is with us tonight? Who else is with us? Names and locations. Miami, Florida, Germany, Clydesdale, Scotland, Oklahoma, Cleveland, Ohio, Jaden, Philly, Connecticut, Minnesota, Attica, New Hampshire, Wallace Sparks, Michigan, Queens, New York City, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Canada, Mo in Pomona, California, Georgia, Germany, Toronto, Las Vegas, Australia, John Doe, Chicago, Illinois, Central Jersey, Southeastern Ohio, Ryan Thomas in Virginia, Rich in Oakland, California, Nashville, Robert in Hawaii, Saturn's Rings, number 9. Harold Sullivan in Florida. Northern California, Wilmington, California, Chaz, Scotland, New York City, Ulysses, Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada, Flavortown, USA. Ali from Oman. Any other names and locations? Shanghai, China, Aaron Huang. Welcome, Aaron. Any other names and locations? Jacksonville, Florida, East Coast, Canada, Chevy Chase, Albany, New York, Larry Chavista Chu, Dan from Iran, Mississippi, JT24, Perth, Western Australia, Springfield, Missouri. Laura Powers thanks me for making the distinguish between prophets versus people. Thank you, Laura. I'll keep doing it as long as I can. Laura in Philadelphia. Synthetic left's corporate HR reformism. Indeed, indeed. Okay, folks, I'm going to pour myself some more orange juice. And on that note, we will start to jump on top of all your super chats. If folks have more super chats, don't be afraid to send them my way. Philly gang is with us. I will give you an answer unless it's about, certain people or topics I've made clear over and over again I'm not going to address or talk about. But for the most part, you'll get an answer, and I'll even answer you by saying I won't answer it. So there you go. Someone said academic power is moving east and Europe. Well, indeed. I mean, China's educational system is taking off. They're training lots of engineers, lots of scientists. I don't know about Europe, though. I mean, is Western Europe, or is their educational system doing better than ours? I mean, they educate, in terms of high school and the education of children, they certainly have better test scores. But I mean, Harvard and Yale are still the standard, are they not? I mean, I don't know about academic power moving east into Europe. I mean, China has invested huge amounts in their educational system, as has Russia. So I think that's what you're alluding to. The effects of the economic system on culture. That was a super chat from Sammy. Well, it's interesting. I've often said that artists, scientists, well, not artists, I mean, not scientists, artists, have long, felt an obligation to make people better with their art, right? Their art was not simply to entertain people, but it was to improve their audience. It was to, make their audience smarter, make their audience better, stuff like that. And nowadays, our art is mass produced for the purpose of making profits. So often, artists, go to the lowest common denominator in the hopes of maximizing revenue. That's why, for example, you see so many remakes because they'd already made money with the first movie, so they can make money with the next movie. Another thing is that I've talked about how gross has taken the place, is the stand-in for so much. For example, right? Instead of making a movie that's very funny, they make a movie that's very gross. Right? When you're grossed out, you might kind of laugh. Instead of making a movie that's very, very scary, a horror story that that makes you scared and is very, very suspense filled and scary, they just show you a bunch of blood and gore and you're grossed out. Right? Instead of making an action movie that's very, very, very exciting, they just show you a lot of shooting and blood and gore, and it's very gross. And they've figured out that gross, in terms of things that you're grossed out by, is like a filler to save them having to do creative work. They can just shock you. They can just shock you. They can just make you uncomfortable. They can use your gut reaction to replace what a clever artistic mind might need to do. Instead of coming up with clever jokes, they just, show you something that makes you go, ugh, instead of, scaring you, they just make you go, ugh. Instead of, giving you a suspense-filled action, exciting movie, they make you go, ugh. Right? That gross can take the place of actual work. And there's no risk, because if you come up with a joke, some people might not get it. If you come up with a scary story, some people might not be scared. Everyone perceives things differently. Let's remember that, right? We all hear things differently. We're all struck by different things differently. We've all lived different lives. We all have different experiences. When you're a public speaker and you read books about public speaking, one thing that they talk about is everyone's going to remember different things from what you said. Right? Not every word strikes people the same way. People have different associations with different phrases and different tones of voice. Some people are really put off by, Southern accents. Some people love Southern accents. Some people are really put off by New Jersey accents. Some people love New Jersey accents. That you can't always predict how these things work. People feel things differently, and that it's a risk. It's a risk. I mean, I don't know about you, but you've probably gone to the movies, and there's been a movie that everyone says is just the most amazing, moving movie, and you've gone to it and gone, I'm not into this. Thoughts on the Pentagon working with mini nuclear warheads to combat, away from combating terror. Okay. All right. Writing it down. Thanks, Joseph. Mini nuclear warheads, Pentagon. Yeah, and that's, and that's happened to all of us. Plus, there's probably also, I've had this experience, but a movie that you think is amazing. You just are really moved by it deeply. And you take a good friend who you think you're very similar to, and they see the movie and they go, I wasn't into it. I just didn't get it. Art hits people differently. And the skill of a good artist is figuring out how to maneuver all of that and to get into people's minds and figure out what can really stimulate people. But not everyone can do it, and it's always a risk. Whenever you produce good art, you're taking a risk. But a capitalist doesn't want to take a risk because they want to make a profit. And profits are definitely affecting the arts and culture. No doubt about it. So there you go. All right. Someone asked about Bolsonaro and Lula. Are they Bonapartists? I would say so. Yeah, to some extent, yeah. Bolsonaro is certainly a right-wing Bonapartist. He's like a Trump kind of. And Lula da Silva was a left-wing Bonapartist. And I think that, Brazil, because it's big enough, it has more of a domestic capitalist class. A lot of countries around the world that are smaller, that are not on the level of Western countries, they just don't have enough oomph on their own. They don't have enough of an economy of their own to really have a strong bourgeoisie that's independent on its own. Brazil is not like that. Brazil, right? Turkey, India. These are countries that have big enough domestic economies that they can have their own orbit, so to speak. And that Lula da Silva, you'll remember when he was president, he was not, he was friendly with Venezuela, he was friendly with Bolivia, but he was definitely not going to completely align with the Bolivarians against Western capitalism. He was friendly with the United States and with the socialist camp of Latin America. He was friendly with both, right? And Brazil kind of had a middle-of-the-road solution, and his successor, Dilma Rousseff, was the same way. They maintained a market economy. They created a bigger welfare state. I know a number of people who lived in Brazil during the time of Lula. They talked about every day they would just have free food, right? And there were just places you could go, and you could get on a line, and you could get free food, right? Well, that's not changing capitalism. That's a social welfare program. And it wasn't like food stamps here, but it was just there were certain places where you got in line, and they gave you food. And you could get free food at lunch every day. That was a program he instituted. And for many very, very poor people in Brazil, that was a huge thing because not only did it mean they got free food, but then they didn't have to spend money on food. If they got in that line, then they could not spend money on one meal every day, and then they had that extra money to spend. And it's an economic stimulus. It's Keynesian, right? It's not socialist necessarily. Lula da Silva, his Workers' Party, was more of a free market party, but they believed in a welfare state. That has changed, especially now that Lula is out of prison. They have moved in a much more Marxist direction. The Communist Party within the Workers' Party has a lot more influence and such. But Lula da Silva was kind of a middle-of-the-road guy. And we saw that can only last so long. Bolsonaro is, at this point, he's in with the Trump crowd. He's in with Trump. He's in with Netanyahu. He's not loved in Europe. They don't like him in the pages of The Economist. They don't like him in the New York Times. He's in with that new right in Europe, and he is a little bit more of a right-wing Bonapartist, right? He's in with one particular faction. He's an evangelical. Most of Brazil is Catholic, he represents a certain faction. And yes, he would like to suppress other sections of the ruling class of Brazil on his own behalf. I don't know how successful he is, but he aspires, he represents one section of the ruling class that's trying to stabilize the country amid a crisis. And he's failing. Right now he has COVID-19. He's handled COVID-19 miserably, almost as bad as the United States has handled it. Kind of like Trump. Trump represents one faction of the American ruling class that's trying to suppress other sections amid a crisis. And when you have a capitalist crisis, you have Bonapartism. It's just kind of natural. That's what happens. Sections of the ruling class fight with each other and try to stabilize the economy. Bolsonaro and Lula are both examples of that. Lula moved in a progressive direction. Lula was more like FDR. Bolsonaro is more like Trump. But ultimately, neither of them were able to really resolve the crisis. The only way to really resolve the crisis is with socialism. But really dramatic, heavy-handed Bonapartism can sometimes bring a dramatic stabilization. Sometimes, not always. But yeah. All right. Now, someone asked about the Eurasian Economic Union. Right, and that Russia is a very big country, but it is in Russia's interest to have stability in that part of the world, whereas Saudi Arabia is trying to fund, Islamic terrorism and instability and Wahhabi extremists. Russia is trying to stabilize, Eastern Europe. That's what it looks like to me. Eastern Europe, Central Asia, they want it to be stable. And they build things like power plants and trains, and they have economic investment projects. Because when people have jobs, they're less likely to be involved in criminal gangs and drug dealing. They're less likely to be involved in terrorist groups. When people are employed, they're generally less likely to be involved in the things that bring instability. Part of the reason we're having a crime wave in the United States right now. Why are we having a crime wave? And people say, oh, it's because of Black Lives Matter. No, it's not because of Black Lives Matter. It's because so many people, number one, don't have a job. Number two, the people who would be in school or at home, right? And it's like there's all these people sitting around that are kind of, when people don't have jobs, when people are not doing things, when they don't have a life in an above-ground economy, they get in a life in an underground economy, right? Crime rates in the last couple months have significantly increased. Why? Because when people don't have opportunities, they make opportunities, and that often looks like crime. Right? When people don't have jobs in factories, when people don't have jobs, to feed their kids, they get involved in drug dealing. They get involved in terrorism. These underground, dangerous things take the place when there's not access to an actual livelihood. And that's what's happening in the United States right now. And I mean, and Russia is trying to make sure that doesn't happen in Central Asia. Central Asia is very, very poor, very, very underdeveloped, and they would like it not to be like that. Eastern Europe, very, very poor, very underdeveloped. They would like to make sure it's not like that. So I think that's what the issue is. Okay. Movementism. Someone asked about movementism. Oh, wow. Australia, xenophobia toward China. Does someone want to repeat that last one? I want to write it down. I want to make sure I get an answer to that. Australia, xenophobia toward China. Repeat that last chat. Australia, xenophobia toward China. What were they asking? Australia, repeat the chat. Repeat the last super chat so I can write it down. Write it down. In Australia, the xenophobia bigotry toward China is getting out of control. Okay, all right. Australia. Out of control. All right. So, movementism. What is movementism? Well, movementism is basically the idea that, it's about the struggle, man. All that socialism and communism, all that bookish stuff, that's not important. It's about the struggle. It's about the struggle. And we've all heard that before. There was Edward Bernstein, who was the leader, was a prominent Marxist theorist. He's the guy who coined the term revisionism. He said, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. The movement is everything, the goal is nothing. And that's pretty much the definition of movementism. It's all about the movement. It's not about the goal. It's not about revolution. It's not about socialism and Marxism and class struggle. It's about the movement, man. It's about feeling really good at rallies and protests. It's about day-to-day struggles. It's about doing whatever the liberals are doing. We've all encountered this, and it's a big problem, and I can't stand it, right? I didn't get interested in Marxism because I wanted to be a liberal. I got interested in Marxism because I was interested in the concept of socialism and building a whole new world. The only purpose of the movement is because it leads to the goal, right? The goal is everything. The movement is nothing. If the movement is not getting you towards your goal, then it has no purpose, right? The goal is everything. The movement is nothing. Edward Bernstein had it exactly wrong. And I have been a big critic of movementism, and that there are certain leftists that really just, to them, being a socialist, being a Marxist, means whatever the liberals are doing, they do it louder and they try to, facilitate it and take it over. If the liberals are marching for, are marching around whatever the latest cause is, they march around that. And they get the permit and they set up the stage, or they, write books about it. And you can see these people that are just movementists. Whatever the movement is doing is what they do. And that's not what it's about. That's tailism, right? That's contrary to what socialism and Marxism is actually about, right? The movement is not everything, and the goal is certainly not nothing. I would say the movement is nothing unless it leads to the goal. Alrighty. Anarcho-primitivism, Derek Jensen, Deep Green Resistance. Okay, so anarcho-primitivism, I really have very, very little respect for ideologically. Going back to nature, technology bad. Come on. I mean, really? That's pretty indefensible. We're going to reduce the human life expectancy back to 25. Going to get rid of medical technology. We're going to get rid of computers. I think the Unabomber, right? The guy who did the Unabombing, the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. I think he was an anarcho-primitivist. Of course, I'm sure Mr. Jensen doesn't think that way, but no, it's dumb. Anarcho-primitivism just strikes me as very, very, very dumb. I ideologically have no admiration for it. Luddites, right? The machine breakers, right? In the time of Marx, there were people who they said things were good before the looms came along. They burned looms. I think it was Ned Ludd, the Luddites. Go back to nature, go back to civilization before industry existed. I don't find it even to be very serious. When you talk to people who talk that way, I don't think they really think it. I think it's just kind of a game. It's like an intellectual game they like to play. They like to argue. It's like a college philosophy class where someone takes an outrageous position and has fun, like proving how smart they are, that they can argue for this outrageous position and they can out-logic everybody else. It's childish edgelordism. I have very little admiration for that. That said, I will say that, I mean, I don't know Derek Jensen's work very well, but I would think the fact that he wants to destroy civilization and go back to pre-industrial days is probably the most controversial thing about him in my book. I mean, if there's anything about him that I would find objectionable, it would be the idea that he wants to roll back human progress and go back to pre-industrial days. However, you'll notice that is not the most controversial thing about Derek Jensen. He said some comments about trans rights, and that's what he's all about. And I mean, agree with him or disagree with him, that's what he's all about. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, I have nothing but sympathy for trans people. I mean, trans people, they get kicked out of their parents' houses. They get treated very badly. Society doesn't respect them. They get discriminated against. They get hate crimes committed against them. I have deep sympathy for trans people, and I'm opposed to any bullying, any hate crimes, any discrimination, any attempt to marginalize them, make them feel like they should be ashamed of who they are, make them feel like they're disgusting. I'm totally opposed to that. I am. I mean, I don't believe in discrimination or repression of transgender people. Other than that, I don't know. I just don't know enough. I don't know enough. I mean, and, I don't know enough. And if that's, I mean, I feel like in my heart, not wanting to do anyone harm is enough. I don't have to understand why they're transgender. I don't have to understand how. I know that there's controversies in the trans community about why they are that way. And, I, in my heart, don't feel like anyone should ever face discrimination or bullying or hate crimes for being who they are. What is Vanguardism compared to Movementism? Okay, Vanguardism compared to Movementism. Alrighty. All right, the next question was purges under Stalin. What's interesting, the term purges refers to when the Bolshevik Party, the purges didn't happen technically. When I get technical, I know people often talk about purges under Stalin, but the purges were in the early years of the Bolshevik Party. Right after the Russian Revolution, everyone and their brother joined the Bolshevik Party. They were the new ruling party, and so everyone joined them. And a lot of people who didn't believe in communism joined the Bolsheviks. And it was a big problem. So they had what they called the purge. And the purge was everyone who wasn't a Bolshevik before the revolution. Was there a super chat I missed? Someone repeat it. Everyone who wasn't a Bolshevik before the revolution had to reapply. They were automatically kicked out of the party, and they had to reapply. If someone wants to repeat a super chat I missed, please repeat it. They had to reapply, basically, is what it was. Will conflict break out in the Caucasus? Okay. Conflict in the Caucasus. And that's what the purges were. And those were in the early years of the Bolshevik Party because a lot of people joined them, and that was that. I think when you say the purges, you're probably referring to the Great Terror, what they call Yezhovshchina, where there were a lot of people being turned in, and there was a great fear of saboteurs and Nazi agents and Japanese spies and Trotskyite wreckers, they called it. I think that's what you're referring to. And that was an awful period in Soviet history. The whole country was kind of whipped up into a state of fear and hysteria. People were very, very afraid. And it was bad. And a lot of people went to gulags who shouldn't have gone to gulags. A lot of people were executed who shouldn't have been executed. The whole country was in a state of hysterical fear. There was the trial. There was a Soviet official named Sergei Kirov who was assassinated. He was assassinated. And after the assassination of Sergei Kirov, there was a lot of fear. A lot of people were executed. And the whole country was very, very afraid. And, it was an awful period. Eventually, Yezhov, the head of the secret police, was executed for counter-revolutionary crimes. It was argued that Yezhov was trying to use the fear in the country to push kind of an ultra-left political agenda. That Yezhov was and the secret police were kind of pushing a more Trotskyist and ultra-leftist political line, and they were trying to use the Great Fear to push the Soviet Union in a more left-wing direction. But it was an awful thing. Even some of the most pro-Stalin people I've read will admit that it was an awful time and that a lot of people suffered who shouldn't have suffered. But then again, was there actually a conspiracy within the Soviet Union to overthrow the Soviet government? Obviously, when the Nazis invaded, there were like two generals who defected and joined the Nazis. Their fears were justified. The idea that the West was just going to sit back and not mess with them. The idea that the Nazis who were planning to invade were not going to have some kind of sabotage. I think that the fear that there was some kind of internal, there were internal conspirators trying to overthrow the Soviet Union. There definitely were. All throughout the Soviet Union's existence, there were people, who were there, who were working with Western capitalism or working with the Trotskyites or working with, the Nazis or whoever trying to sabotage the Soviet Union. And I think 1937 is the year that the fear of the great, of the great foreign conspiracy or whatever just kind of exploded, and people call it the Great Terror. And I think that's what you're referring to. And that there were the Moscow trials that happened, where Zinoviev and Kamenev and some other leaders, Bukharin, were convicted of conspiring against Stalin. And they were kind of public show trials, and they confessed to having worked with Trotsky. Now, many people maintain that their confession was under threat of torture or something like that. That was just not a good time. But compared to World War II, it wasn't anywhere near as bad as World War II, and it was kind of, the country was psyching up. They knew that the Nazis were going to were going to invade. There was a lot of fear, and that was that. It was a bad time. The Soviet Union, you have to remember, they had just industrialized. They had raised themselves up out of poverty. They had constructed modern apartment buildings. They had electrified the country. They'd wiped out illiteracy. They'd built all these new universities. But the trauma of the Civil War and of the Tsar and thousands of years of Tsarism and the blockade in the 1920s was all there. Societies don't just automatically heal the day the revolution happens, right? That's not how these things work. There's no societies don't just, all the baggage and all the pain and all the suffering doesn't just magically disappear because you have a communist revolution. And even though they had done a lot to industrialize and build a stable society, the Great Terror showed that a lot of the fear and terror and hysteria was still there. And there was a great fear of, foreign sabotage. And, Okay, syndicalism versus Marxism-Leninism. Well, that's interesting, right? Most of the time when people say syndicalism, they're referring to anarcho-syndicalism. Anarcho-syndicalism being that every factory is autonomous and controlled by its workers, and the factories trade with each other. But syndicalism cannot just refer to anarcho-syndicalism. It can also just refer to syndicalism, which is a wing of the socialist movement that rejected political action and favored only labor union action. They didn't believe in building political parties. They didn't believe in running for office. They didn't even believe in trying to seize control of the government. They were just about seizing control of the workplace, and that they believed that the road to revolution was a big general strike. A big general strike would take place where all the workers refused to go to work, and the workers would then seize the factories with the giant general strike. It'd be like this this Gotterdammerung, the Great Strike. Rosa Luxemburg, she wrote a pamphlet about this concept called Mass Strike. George Sorel, who was kind of an inspiration for fascism, was a syndicalist, and he talked about how the myth of the Great Strike was really, really important, to the syndicalist movement. But yeah, syndicalism was the wing of the left or socialism that rejects all political action and favors simply direct action on the job. Now, there's anarcho-syndicalism, which is like ties it in with anarchism and is for every factory being autonomous. There's syndicalism, which is just, workplace action. Marxism-Leninism, on the other hand, wants to build a vanguard party that seizes control of the state. It seeks to establish a socialist government, a Marxist-Leninist government, a dictatorship of the proletariat, like Lenin talked about. I think that's the difference. One ideology, Marxism-Leninism, seeks to control the state, while syndicalism basically argues that no state action, no political action. Turkmenistan is called the North Korea of Central Asia, and the ruling party is the Communist Party. Whoa, one more time. Repeat that. That went by really fast. It was about Turkmenistan and whoa, Nelly, went by really fast. I'm going to give you an answer, but you have to repeat it because that went by really fast. Essentially, however, they repudiated communism and are called far right. What's going on there? I don't know. I actually don't know much about Turkmenistan. I'll have to investigate that. So I will investigate Turkmenistan because I don't know enough to answer your question. So I don't want to give you inaccurate information because that would not be professional. So I am going to look it up and I'll get back to you on that. Right? I don't know enough about Turkmenistan. Some people seem to think I know everything. I don't know everything. And every live, it becomes apparent. People ask me questions about random people in history I've never heard of. I don't know everything. So Turkmenistan, can't give you an answer. Alrighty. All right, so syndicalism versus Marxism-Leninism. Brezhnev tried to fix the why didn't Brezhnev try to fix the Sino-Soviet split? Actually, they did. 1964, Kosygin and Brezhnev took power and removed Khrushchev. And they did attempt to restore relations with China, and China wasn't going to have it. There were Soviet attempts to be friendlier to China. One of them was that they did attempt to, and they were successful to get Red China, People's China, on the get them on the what do you call it? On the UN Security Council, and to get them recognized by the United Nations. So that was something. The Soviet Union, they could have done better, but they did make some attempts to try and restore relations with China, but it wasn't good enough. Let's remember that Albania sided with China in the Sino-Soviet split, and Khrushchev tried to overthrow the Albanian government. He tried to pull off a coup in Albania. Brezhnev, and you also have to remember that Brezhnev's politics shifted, right? Originally it was Kosygin and Brezhnev. But around 1970, Soviet politics became much more anti-imperialist, whereas China started becoming, more aligned with Western capitalism. I think that Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring, was kind of a turning point, because it was very clear that Western capitalism was involved in destabilizing Prague and trying to stir up, the revolts and Czechoslovakia in 1968. And I think the fact that the Soviet Union was forced into a position where they had to send the military to Czechoslovakia, that kind of woke them up that they needed to be more anti-imperialist. So there you go. All right. Landlords in China and Cuba. Well, in Cuba, the way it generally has worked is that after you've lived in your home for like 4 years, you own it, and your rent can never be more than 10% of your income. And then you own it automatically once you've lived there for 4 years. However, now in Cuba, they have changed the rules that you're allowed to sell your home. It used to be that you weren't allowed to sell your home. Now you can sell your home. Now, China is a different situation. There's a lot of private real estate in China. So, That's a different situation. But they have taken dramatic action to control real estate prices. President Xi Jinping gave a speech where he talked about how housing is for living in, not for speculation. And they have actually, done a lot to try and control real estate prices. But yeah, there's a lot of private real estate and renters and landlords in China. Cuba, on the other hand, yeah, very different situation. Thoughts on Bloc Quebec? Okay. Quebec. Alrighty. Oh, so Me Too movement in China especially. Well, sexual harassment is unacceptable. It's unprofessional behavior. Shouldn't go on. No one should experience sexual harassment. Period. There's no room for it. And that's it. I mean, that's it. There are some things that are very, very, very clearly sexual harassment, and no one should experience them. What Matt Lauer was doing, yeah, not okay. What Charlie Rose was doing, not okay. And that the problem with a lot of the capitalist workplaces is that people in order to get ahead, people endure stuff they shouldn't have to endure, and women in particular, and shouldn't go on. And a lot of these men in media, a lot of these men in workplaces in general have done very, very predatory things, and because they're in a position of power. That's all there is to it. And have these things gone on in China? Perhaps. I haven't followed Me Too in China in particular, but yeah, sexual harassment is never okay. Um, you know, Sexual assault, sexual harassment, rape, these things are never okay. So there you go. I hope that answered the question. Marijuana. Well, first things first, legalize marijuana. There's no reason that people should be in jail for smoking marijuana. Unbelievable. The fact that millions of people have gone to jail or have criminal records because they smoked marijuana is ridiculous, okay? Alcohol is arguably worse for you than marijuana. Now, to be fair, marijuana is much more potent these days than it was a long time ago. And that, honestly, I'll be real with you folks, I've never smoked marijuana. You might think I'm lying, or you might think I'm the biggest nerd in the world. Well, maybe I'm the biggest nerd in the world because I haven't smoked marijuana. I never have. I had very controlling parents who didn't let me go to parties in high school, and so I just never did that. And then after I was in high school, I was in Marxist-Leninist groups, and they don't allow that. Communist groups don't allow you to use drugs generally. They tend to be very rigid about that, and I think that's a good rule because people want to drink on their own time or do what they want on their own time. It's one thing, but if you're being active in a political group, you generally shouldn't be getting high and doing that kind of thing. But that said, if people want to do that, that's their business. I think that when people develop an addiction, or a problematic habit, they should be able to get, rehabilitation, and there should be services available for people who have an addiction. And that's all there is to that. I will say though, I am a little bit suspicious. I'm stepping on a lot of toes here, and I know that. I don't, whenever I go to a Bernie Sanders event, if, he says, and I want to legalize marijuana, and the crowd goes, yeah, weed. There's this huge round of applause. That kind of makes me uncomfortable, right? I believe people should be allowed to do that if they want to do that. Personal choice. Definitely don't criminalize it. But is that really what I want to be encouraged? Is people getting intoxicated? I don't, there's just part of me, I don't know if it's the way I was brought up. It's, it's just, if it was during Prohibition and he said, I want to legalize alcohol, if people had gone, yeah, booze, I would go, no, I've drank alcohol on many occasions. I don't drink anymore, but, but I never would have thought it was appropriate. I don't feel like one should be proud to get high. I don't feel like one should be proud to get drunk. You know what I mean? These are not, there are some people that are able to drink responsibly. And I myself, I never had a drinking problem. Every time I drank, I got dizzy. My head would hurt. It just made me physically ill. And so I was like, why? I'm not going to do that anymore. But, I'm not saying that people shouldn't be able to do this or definitely shouldn't be criminalized for doing it. But at the same time, I'm not comfortable with the idea that this is like what we should promote. This is yes, people getting high on marijuana is something we want to promote. I'm not sure about that. I don't think I would ever advise anyone to smoke marijuana. If someone came to me and said, Caleb, should I smoke marijuana or shouldn't I? I'd say you probably shouldn't. You know, that's what I would tell you if I was just being honest. Right? If you wanted my opinion about what you should do, should I or should I not smoke marijuana? I would probably tell you not to. But I've never done it, so maybe I'm full of garbage. But, if someone came to me and said, hey, Caleb, I'm thinking about getting drunk tonight. Should I get drunk or not? I would probably tell you not to. But then again, you have the right to do it. You shouldn't go to jail just for getting drunk. You shouldn't go to jail just for getting high. So it's complicated. I just feel like, I want to be at my best. And I feel like if I'm drunk, I'm not at my best. If I were to be high, I assume I would not be at my best. So I just, I wear a suit. I feel like there needs to be more professionalism on the left. You don't go to work drunk. You don't go to work high on drugs. And I feel like if we're going to take this seriously, if people want to relax or whatever and enjoy themselves sometimes, fine. But that's not what it's about. And I hope that answers your question. So, yeah, I'm not opposed to it. There's some interesting theories people have about marijuana and how it impacts the culture. And, I do know that the marijuana these days is a lot more potent and probably has a bigger effect on your body than it did, people who smoked weed 50 years ago. It was a totally different thing. The THC level was much different. There was somebody I knew in college who had never smoked marijuana before, and he smoked marijuana, and he smoked a particularly potent marijuana. The THC level was very, very high. And he actually started having hallucinations, and he kind of freaked out. It caused him some intense agony. Somebody who lived in the college dorm I lived in, and he just, no one saw him for 3 days. He, locked himself in his dorm room for 3 days. And it's because he smoked weed, and the weed he smoked was very, very powerful. And it just caused him to flip out. Well, would he have been better off not having that experience? Probably. Now, there's probably some people out there that are regular marijuana smokers saying, wow, where did that guy get his shit from, man? I want to get my hands on that. Well, but he'd never done it before. He didn't know what was going to hit him. And so apparently this guy in my college dorm, he huffed, and it was the first time he'd ever smoked weed, and he flipped out. And it caused him to just kind of shut down and not leave his dorm room for 3 days. And that scared me. I saw that and I thought, geez, I don't want to be in that situation. So, to each their own, whatever. If you ask me my opinion, personally, I would advise you not to get drunk, and I would advise you not to get high. But no one should be criminalized for doing it. It's your life. You can do what you want to do. And, there's part of me that just feels like that's just not the way one should be. I don't know if it's the fact that, my mother's family in particular, my dad's family too are Protestant Irish, but my mother's family in particular, my grandparents were teetotalers. They didn't drink. My mother barely ever drank. She drank once a year or something. Sometimes at a wedding, she would have a little bit of wine. She didn't drink. And there was just a feeling, especially in my mother's family, that drinking alcohol was just not a good thing to do. Not that people were bad if they did it. Not that it was not okay mildly. It wasn't like a sin or anything. There was just a feeling that one shouldn't do it. My father's family, they drank, right? They would drink beer and watch football, and that was kind of the American way. And, but there was just a feeling that I got, especially from my mother's family, that drinking alcohol is not a good thing to do. It's something one should be very careful about doing. It's a vice, right? It's a vice. It's not, and I just, that's kind of just, it's just kind of the feeling that I have. And having, in college and, even up until 3 or 4 years ago, 2050 to cause a world war, China dominance, writing it down. All right. There's just kind of a feeling that I've always had that just, my mother's family, a long line. I'm actually, linked, I'm descended from Charles G. Finney, the founder of the, Second Great Awakening, one of the most famous, ministers in U.S. history. And, they, founders of Oberlin College and all of that. And it was just part of their Protestant religious tradition was that they didn't believe in drinking. And, my father's family drank, and none of them were alcoholics. They were okay with it. They didn't get drunk. They drank mildly. And, I guess, I just, for whatever reason, as I became an adult, I became more like my mother's family. I have very long, bony fingers. Alcohol doesn't go well with my body. It makes me ill, right? There's sometimes I'll drink one glass of wine and my head just, it would just hurt. So I just thought, I'm not going to do this anymore. And there are some cultures, in Muslim countries, they think drinking alcohol is bad. They say never do it. Mormons don't drink alcohol. And alcohol does cause a lot of problems. And I know people who have become alcoholics and had big problems with it. So I remember the day that I drank the last time I ever drank alcohol, I was at the movies, and it was on July 4th, like 3-4 years ago now. And there was a movie theater in Brooklyn where you could, order wine and watch the movie. So I was sitting in the movie theater with my wife. And they bring you the menu before the movie starts, and they ask what you want. And I asked for a glass of wine. So they bring me the glass of wine. The movie theater goes dark. I've got my glass of white wine, like Riesling, in my hand. And they start showing the previews, and I took my first sip. And immediately my head started hurting. And I was like, oh God, my head is going to hurt this whole movie. And I was just like, is this what I want to do? Is this what I want to do for 2 hours? I want to sit here and be in pain. And I didn't finish my glass of wine. I was walking out of the movie theater with my wife, and I said to my wife, I am never going to, I think I'm just going to stop drinking. And my wife was like, yeah, it's probably for the best. It was just at that moment, I just decided, what, alcohol and me don't mix. There were times in college where I was partying and, got drunk and threw up, and, people do crazy things when they're young, but no, I would just say, don't do it. Do it if you can enjoy it. If it's good for you, do it carefully. Don't drink and drive, drink responsibly, drink as an adult if you're 21. But, I don't regret not doing it, honestly. I don't regret not doing it. I don't regret giving it up. So, but to each their own. I am totally addicted to unnamed diet beverage. If I don't have my Diet Coke, I'm dependent on that. And when you're dependent on something, that's the thing. When you're dependent on something, it has power over you. Right? I need unnamed diet beverage. If I don't have unnamed diet beverage, I'm going to have a very difficult morning. I wake up and I pour that, diet soda and I drink it. And that's not a good addiction. That's not good for my kidneys. It's not good for you at all, right? It's not good for your organs. People talk about it's toilet cleaner. I've heard it all. People would always tell me, don't drink this. It's embalming fluid. It's toilet cleaner. It's, and I admit it's not a good habit, right? I don't smoke. Thank goodness for that. But, is drinking diet soda compulsively better than smoking? Now it is. They say that, but maybe 50 years from now, they'll find out that aspartame contains something worse than cancer or something. I don't know. So, there you go. Unnamed orange beverage. So, there you go. Way too long of an answer to that question, but that's okay. All right. Okay. So someone says, what if they've been depressed for a long time? I would seek professional help. If you're suffering serious mental health concerns, you need to speak to a mental health professional, which I am not a mental health professional, so I am not the person to tell you what to do. This person asked me what they should do if they're a long time depressed. My answer is see a mental health professional. Alrighty. Co-ops are not socialist. Yeah. Right. Co-ops still function according to the market, right? A co-op is, it's a business in which every employee is a shareholder. And instead of getting a wage, they get a percentage of the profits. And that's good. It's good for a number of reasons. It's good, first of all, because of the fact that no one's exploiting anyone else. There's no surplus value. It's also good because there's more of a incentive for people to do more, right? Because they share in the profits. They're not just clocking in and clocking out. The better the company does, the more money they make. So they have better incentive. Worker co-ops are good. I am not against worker co-ops. However, they are not socialism. because they still function according to market logic. You could have a worker co-op that made weapons, right? Made weapons, and they would want to go to war, and they would lobby for more war. You could have a military-industrial complex if every military corporation was a co-op, right? You could have big drug companies. If they were all co-ops, they would still probably want to maximize the sale of opioid painkillers because more profits. Worker co-ops would eliminate jobs with technology. Why? Because if you're a part of the worker co-op, the fewer people that work there, the bigger the share of the profits you're going to get. So you're going to want to develop technology so that company has as few workers as possible, right? A lot of the problems with capitalism are not eliminated by worker co-ops. The problem of the exploitation of the worker and the wage worker having a contrary interest with the employer, that problem is eliminated, right? The employer wants to maximize his profits, and so he's working the employee as hard as he can. Yes, that problem of capitalism, the problem of the worker and the boss, the proletarian and the bourgeoisie, the exploitation of the worker is eliminated by worker co-ops. That is true. But it's still, they actually, it's funny, the worker co-op thing for a long time was considered an alternative to communism. They used to call it cooperative capitalism. And there was a whole school of economics, of like liberal economists that said, we don't have to have communism, we can have cooperative capitalism. Google it. It was a really common thing during the Cold War. There'd be people come along who's like, well, Marx was right about the exploitation of the common man, but Soviet workers, get worked really hard, and what we need is cooperative capitalism. No one thought it was socialism. Nobody thought it was socialism. Everyone understood that cooperative capitalism was an alternative to socialism. All right? Well, we don't have to have socialism. We can just have cooperative capitalism. It's only recently that people have decided that what they used to call cooperative capitalism is what socialism really is. No, it's not, right? No, it's not. And distributism is something else. That's Catholic economics. It's like localism and stuff. That's a different thing entirely. That's a Roman Catholic anti-capitalist theory someone's mentioning. Alrighty. Climate disaster in the global south. Well, we're already seeing it, right? The super hurricanes, the flooding, the unpredictable weather. And yes, people in the developing world are going to be hit a lot harder by the coming climate crisis of climate change. Climate change is a reality, folks. I do not deny climate change for a minute. Climate change is a reality, but the answer is human progress. We have to get off of fossil fuels. We need fusion energy. We need a higher fuel source. We need to get beyond fossil fuels. Climate change is definitely a reality and definitely a problem. And to combat it, we need human progress. We need to get out of the prison of fossil fuels. And the developing world is going to be hit by it pretty hard. They're already suffering. I mean, part of what spawned the Arab Spring was the drought throughout the Middle East, and that's why Libya, with the great man-made river. That's why Libya was handling the Arab Spring much better than other people. So, yeah, there you go. Okay. Stalin and Trotsky's murder. Well, yeah, it was the KGB. It was the Soviet secret police that killed Trotsky. No question about it. Some people will try to say that that's not true, but no, he was working with the Soviet intelligence, the guy who killed Trotsky. What people don't talk about is that Mexico, he was arrested. He went to prison in Mexico. After he got out of prison, he went to Cuba. And people say, well, Cuba gave him safe passage to the Soviet Union. They gave him a lot more than safe passage. They gave the guy who killed Trotsky a medal and a parade. They treated him like a hero. The guy who killed Trotsky was treated like a hero in Cuba. And that's hilarious. A lot of Trotskyists try to pretend Cuba is Trotskyists, they just don't know it. Or unconscious Trotskyist is a word that the SWP even used. That's ridiculous. Fidel Castro is not a Trotskyist. Che Guevara, not a Trotskyist, and they really liked the guy who killed Trotsky. They gave him a parade and a medal, and they thought he was a hero. No one talks about that. After the guy killed Trotsky, he did like 20 years in jail, and then he got out of prison, and he went to Cuba, and in Cuba they gave him a big parade and sent him home to the Soviet Union like a hero. Was Trotsky friends with Frida Kahlo? Yes, he was. They lived together for a while. The movie about Frida Kahlo's life says that she had sex with him We don't know if that really happened. They were living together. Trotsky's wife and Frida Kahlo didn't like each other and had some kind of fight. And after that, no one talks about this, but after that, Frida Kahlo really hated Trotsky. And she gave interviews and she said he was a weakling and pathetic. And she actually painted a picture, self with Stalin. Look this up. Frida Kahlo, self with Stalin. There's a picture of her with Stalin. And in her house, in her home, she has a picture on her bedside. She has Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao on her bed. Right? I mean, do you think she's in the RCP or something? She has Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao on her bed. So, yeah, she lived with Trotsky for a while. But she had a falling out with Trotsky, and she became, in the final years of her life, she was a tanky. It's pretty wild. Now, her ex-husband, her partner, Diego Rivera was, people say he was a Trotskyist. He wasn't. He was a right oppositionist, right? There was the left opposition was Trotsky. There was the Bukharinites, the right opposition. That's actually what he was a member of. He was a member of the right opposition, the Bukharinite opposition, which I think is interesting. And then the Bukharinites kind of had a relationship with Trotsky. The other thing is that many people believe that Diego Rivera was a police informer. That he was informing on leftists to the Mexican police. I think there's been some confirmation of that. Frida Kahlo wasn't doing that. And I don't know about that. I mean, they destroyed his painting. I mean, he'd been a beautiful painting in Rockefeller Center, and because it had Lenin in it, they destroyed it. I mean, the work of Diego Rivera, if you go to the Detroit Art Institute, it's beautiful, just beautiful stuff. I mean, his work is socialist realism. Those murals are amazing, amazing stuff. So, with an artist, you have to appreciate them as an artist, right? You don't have to appreciate them as political, right? You can recognize that all art has a political message, but you don't have to necessarily agree, right? I don't support the right opposition, especially if Diego Rivera was working with the police, against communism. I don't agree with that. But if he made great paintings, great, interesting. All right, cool. Yeah, Bolivia. Evo Morales was the elected leader. He won the elections. Even the fraud that was reported, he still would have won the elections overwhelmingly. The military toppled the government. And it's unbelievable. It's a coup. It was a coup that happened in Bolivia. It was a coup, and the elected government has been ousted. And, yeah, right? And I was on Twitter as the coup was happening. And all these dumb people were saying, this isn't about Evo Morales. This is about democracy. This isn't about America. You're so racist. Well, it was a coup. The whole world knows it was a coup. Áñez is, really hostile to the indigenous people and, fascism. And it's a coup. And the people of Bolivia should have free elections. Evo Morales should be the president once again. The movement towards socialism should be allowed to participate in the elections, and that's all there is to it. I mean, it's outrageous. Bolivia had the highest rate of GDP growth of any country. Talk about the ruling in Oklahoma for the Creek Nation. I don't know enough about that. I haven't followed it. I mean, it is outrageous. It is absolutely outrageous that what has happened in Bolivia has happened, because Bolivia was having a huge amount of economic success. Right? I mean, the socialist policies, the state controlling the means of production, they were doing amazing things. Huge achievements because the government was controlling the major industries and planning the economy, coordination with Russia and China. They were doing amazing stuff. They were having a huge rate of economic growth, and then they were overthrown. The military was compromised. There were clearly people in the military that were working with the U.S. government. That hasn't happened in Venezuela because the military is much more closely, controlled by the socialist forces, and it's trained in Cuba and ideological. And but forces that were not good were able to penetrate the military. And of course, like they always do, they had a group of protesters. What determines whether a worker becomes ML, a trot, or a fascist during a capitalist crisis? Is it just education? Writing it down. Trot. So yeah, I mean, Bolivia's situation is outrageous. All kinds of political repression there. The left should be in power. They had very key economic success. All right, mini nuclear warheads from the Pentagon. Yeah, I mean, what Trump is doing right now with the nuclear arms escalation is pretty unbelievable. It's pretty unbelievable. You know, I mean, there's talk of restarting nuclear testing. They ripped up the treaty, some of the treaties with Russia. This is not good. You know, we shouldn't be back on the Cold War train. If you don't believe in the Cold War, if you know don't like nuclear war, and you should be very outraged about what Trump is doing. He's trying to restart the arms race because he's close to military manufacturing corporations, and it's not a good idea. You know, I mean, this is not good at all. And they lie. I mean, I did a video. There's a video you can watch. You know, I mean, they lie in order to restart nuclear weapons and such. They tell lies. They tried to claim Russia did a nuclear test. It was actually an earthquake. So, yeah. All right. Australia, xenophobia against China is out of control. Yeah, and what do you do about it? Well, where do you think it's coming from? It's coming from the United States. It's not coming from Australia. Australia has really economically benefited from trade with China. I mean, I before this pandemic, I would see Australian tourists all the time. The Australian currency had a much bigger, you know, was very well valued, and it was increasing in value. You know, Australia has really benefited from trade with China. It's Australia becoming hostile to China serves the United States. It doesn't serve Australia. Australia and China, you know, I mean, have a lot to gain from each other. So, you know, think about that. If you're an Australian and you're getting into this anti-China hysteria, you're serving the United States. You're not serving Australia. So even from like an Australian nationalist perspective, you shouldn't be going along with this bullshit. Okay. All right, Vanguardism compared to Movementism. Right, well, Movementism is just tailing after whatever is popular in the movement. The Vanguard puts forward its own program. It puts forward its own vision of what society should be, and it builds a mass organization centered around it, right? It comes up with demands, it comes up with issues, and it leads the masses of people, and it builds its own center of power. That's the difference, right? If you read What Is to Be Done by Lenin, he talks about how you build the party of a new type, that it functions as a tribune of the people. Mao Zedong talked about the mass line, from the masses to the masses. So, yeah, the Vanguard Party, you know, unleashes the people, you know, by making them aware of their own strength, by raising demands that escalate the struggle. If you actually want to know about the role of the Vanguard Party, you should see the movie The Magnificent Seven, which is based on the movie The Seven Samurai. See that. Or you should see A Bug's Life. Right? I mean, it's all the same story, basically. And, you know, the story is, it's a cowboy movie, right? Magnificent Seven. There's this village of Mexican farmers, and every year this group of bandits comes and robs them and steals their crops. And they're sick of this. They're sick of it. They don't want to be robbed. So they go and they hire some, you know, cowboys to protect their town. Or, you know, in A Bug's Life, you know, it's the ants, and they get robbed by the grasshoppers every year. So they hire some circus bugs to protect their town, or their ant farm, right? Well, turns out the cowboys or the circus bugs or whatever have lied about their background. They aren't really who they are. So the people of the village or the ant farm or whatever, they get disappointed. And so the bad guys, the bandits, come to rob them, and they're so disappointed. They thought they were going to get protected this year. But then somebody in the village says, you know what? We don't have to take this. And fights back. And it turns out all along they didn't need the circus bugs. They didn't need the cowboys. Because they had the strength all along. And how the Vanguard doesn't overthrow capitalism for the workers. It makes the workers aware of their own strength. Right? The workers could overthrow capitalism all by themselves. They don't have the consciousness to do it. That's the understanding. The Vanguard doesn't overthrow capitalism for the workers. If you do that, that's Louis-Auguste Blanc, and that's ultra-leftism, right? The idea we're going to have a military coup and take power. No, it doesn't work that way. The masses themselves make the revolution, but the Vanguard Party gives them the consciousness to understand that they're capable of making a revolution, right? And that's what the movie Seven Samurai is about. The filmmaker was himself a Marxist. That's why he made the movie. And it was such a good movie, they made The Magnificent Seven, and then they made A Bug's Life. And, it's about the role of the Vanguard Party, pretty much, right? It's got a kind of a Marxist message, right? They didn't need the circus bugs. They didn't need the cowboys. They could have fought the bandits all along. They just weren't aware of their own strength. The proletariat is not aware of its own strength, so it needs a Vanguard Party to awaken it and empower it and give it the consciousness to utilize its strength. Will there be a conflict in the Caucasus? Maybe. I mean, I don't know. I don't follow things in the Caucasus very closely. I know that Urban Proletariat gave me some money. Thank you for the super chat. Much appreciated. But yeah, I don't follow things in the Caucasus very closely. Someone said that because I have red hair, I look like I could be from the Caucasus Mountains. And when I was in Iran, I remember they took me to an event where there were a lot of people. And I saw some people with bright red hair like I had. And I said, "Oh, you have redheads here in Iran." They said, "Yep, they're Caucasians." And I thought, Caucasians? That's white people. But they meant people from the Caucasus Mountains. There you go. Chechens. People in Chechnya often have red hair. That's why a lot of the ISIS fighters had red hair, mind you, because a lot of them were Chechens, right? The CIA was funding the Islamic separatists in Chechnya. They lost, so a lot of them went to Syria and fought against Assad and became ISIS. So there you go. But yeah, I don't follow the Caucasus events very closely, but I would fit in there from what I understand with my red hair and my red beard. I would walk around the Caucasus and people would be like, "Oh, you're Joe from over there," and I'd be like, "No, I'm actually Caleb from Ohio and New York City," and they'd be like, "Oh, that's funny." But yeah, I mean, apparently I look like a Caucasian, but there you go. Okay, I learned that in Iran. I learned that I look like a Caucasian. So there you go. And not a white person Caucasian, but someone from the Caucasus Mountains. I find that to be funny. Whatever. I'm not going to read that out loud. That's a very strange phrase that Ammon Faber just sent me. I don't quite get what you're getting there. I don't think there are many Muslims who support Trump, so I don't quite know what you're getting at by sending me that. I don't know if you're just being ironic or what. Very strange phrase. So there you go. But I appreciate the super chat. And I gave you an answer. You'll get an answer if you send it to me. All right, Quebec, right? Yeah, the people of Quebec deserve to have territorial sovereignty, right? I mean, they speak the French language. And the people of Quebec, I will say, they have a fighting spirit, I mean, read about the general strikes that happened there. That was great stuff. And there's a spirit of class struggle in Quebec that is very strong. So there you go. Yeah. Okay, will China's rise cause World War III? I should certainly hope not. I would certainly hope that it wouldn't cause World War III. I would hope that there would be enough common sense for the West to not resort to an all-out war just to stop China's rise. But I could see it happening, and I'm very, very afraid of it. And that's why I end every live with that speech about the danger of a new world war still exists, because, I very much fear that such a thing could happen. I hope it doesn't. But yeah, they're trying. That's what these wars are about. It's about keeping countries poor. It's about beating them down. It's not about, the West doesn't invest in countries to make them wealthy. It invests in them to keep them poor. All right. What determines whether a worker becomes a trot, an ML, or a fascist in a moment of crisis? Well, I'm going to tell you something that you're probably not going to want to hear. But in a moment of crisis, like a civil war or revolution, most people, not the people who listen to lives like this, most people just kind of do. Most people in the world are not deeply political, right? Think about it. In red states, most people vote for Republicans. Why? Well, they're in a state where most people are Republicans. They're, they go to church. Most people in the church are Republicans. They live in a neighborhood where people are Republicans. They work with people who are Republicans. Their parents were Republicans, so they're Republicans. In New York City, most people are Democrats. Why? Well, the people they work with are Democrats. People in their neighborhood are Democrats. People they work with are Democrats. People, I mean, so they vote for Democrat. Most people don't really think about this stuff with very much depth, okay? I'm being real with you. I'm just being completely real with you. During the Civil War in China, there were very few villagers in rural China who got a copy of Mao's writings and got a copy of Chiang Kai-shek's writings and sat there and said, should I join the People's Liberation Army? Oh, why don't I form a Vanguard party? Should I join the People's Liberation Army or the KMT army? I'm going to study Chiang Kai-shek's writings and Mao's writings and determine which one is the best for me. Why not? No, it was what village you were in, right? Who liberated your village? If you were if your village was liberated by the Red Army, and the Red Army was doing good stuff for you, you joined with them. If you were in an area that was a KMT stronghold, and everyone you knew was KMT, what are your thoughts on the Stone Mountain, Georgia, a black nationalist led hundreds of armed folks against the KKK? Oh, okay. I mean, a lot of people, when push comes to shove, it's just who they're around. They don't think about this stuff with very much depth. They don't think about this stuff, it's just kind of who they're around. There were neighborhoods in Germany where the poor people were all communists, and there were neighborhoods in Germany where the poor people were all Nazis. There were neighborhoods, in Russia where the Bolsheviks had a lot of influence. There were neighborhoods in Russia where the Bolsheviks didn't. I mean, for most people, it's just kind of who they're around, who they're around, and, that's it, right? For people like us, if you're listening to this, you're the kind of person that thinks about these things with great depth, and I applaud you for that. And we should be, we should recognize that we're a little bit, more politically involved and a little more aware of our world than most people are. But I'm just telling you, most people, it doesn't work that way. And that's why building political infrastructure is so damn important. It's not about being king of the protest cage. It's about organizing in neighborhoods. There should be communist food banks. There should be communist community centers. There should be communist events where people learn communist songs. It's about building political infrastructure. It's about building political infrastructure. Because if you don't have that, it doesn't matter, right? And that at the end of the day, if there's a moment of crisis and people are in a neighborhood where they've been getting food from a communist food bank and they've gone to a few communist meetings and heard communist speeches, and there's a communist organizer in their apartment building or on their block who they know is a good guy, they're going to be with the communists. And if people are in a neighborhood where the white supremacists and fascists are there, and the white supremacists and fascists have been feeding them, and they've been hearing fascist and white supremacist propaganda, they're going to be with the white supremacists and fascists. It's a matter of how much political infrastructure exists. The Bolivarians, they took power because they built political infrastructure. That's what matters. Are you in the communities? Are you feeding people? Do you have a base? A base area. That's what communists or in the rest of the world always have. They have a base area. Everybody knows in Paris, the communist neighborhood. Everyone knows in South Africa, the communist neighborhoods. Communists have base areas. Well, in the United States, the Black Panthers had base areas. The Communist Party USA had base areas back in the day. But nowadays, communists don't do that. Nowadays, communists, they get together and, argue with each other and whatever. But there needs to be an aim for the whole population. And it's about you need to have a base in communities and neighborhoods. And that requires getting out of the movement and getting to the masses. And that's what ultimately matters. When people are getting community services from you, being fed by you, they see you in the neighborhood, they depend on you, your ideas are widely dispersed among the population, you have an influence. When you're an obscure interest, that people just kind of know about from the internet or whatever, you don't. So there you go. So why not start a Vanguard party? because it wouldn't be a Vanguard party, first of all. When Lenin formed the Vanguard, the Bolsheviks, that he got every serious organizer into a room and said, we need a party of a new type, and all the great, well-known Marxist organizers were there. Nowadays, the way things work in the U.S. political left is that there's only allowed to be one smart person in a group, and then they have to split. And, Vanguard, there's a million Vanguard parties, and none of them are doing anything. None of them really have any influence. If I were to get up and announce, I, Caleb Maupin, am starting the Revolutionary Workers Combat Liberation Party League 4th International Committee, it would be a joke. It would just be a joke, right? When something serious comes along, it won't be one or two people's ego trip. It'll be about getting as many people into it as possible, right? And that there's way too many parties in the United States. And none of them really have any influence. Some of them are better than others, sure, but none of them really have any influence. None of them have a base. None of them have a base. None of them have a base. And they're not really moving to set up a base either. None of them really have a base, and none of them really want to have a base. They're all kind of doing something different. I actually told a joke, and why not tell it, right? Before I get to the Stone Mountain thing. I used to tell this joke about American communists. All right? So there's a man who has a dream, and the voice of God in the dream tells him, hire a communist to work at your law firm. So he says, okay, I am going to hire a communist to work at my law firm. So he goes and he hires somebody from a certain communist group to work at his law firm. And he hires them, and they're working at his law firm. And he says, I want you to file these papers by the end of the day. So he goes away, he comes back at the end of the day, and he says to the communists, so did you file the papers? And they say to him, can you believe it? Donald Trump is still president. The Republicans have a majority in Congress. I can't file the papers now. I mean, maybe if we can defeat Trump and take back Congress, maybe then we can start to talk about filing the papers. But right now, we need to focus on defeating the ultra-right. We can't file these papers. He says, give me a break. You're fired. He gets rid of him. He says, okay, that guy must not have really been a communist. I'm going to find another communist. I'm going to find another communist to file my papers. So he goes and he finds, a communist and says to him, all right. He says, file my papers. By the end of the day, I need you to go file my papers. Goes back. At the end of the day, the guy's not there. But all the papers that he told him to file are gone. So he goes and he finds him, and he's out on the street trying to sell the papers to people. Here, did you get a latest copy of the paper? And he said, I didn't tell you to sell the papers. I told you to file the papers. And he's like, yeah, but he said, I made $4 selling your papers. I even got someone's contact information. And he said, yeah, but I told you to file the papers. Your job was to file the papers, not to sell the papers, not to tell it, to hold on and wait for the Republicans to be defeated. You need to file the papers. So that guy fired, got rid of him. Third guy comes along, says to him, all right. He says, you sound like a real communist, right? Now I bet you will file the papers. So goes away, comes back. The papers are still not filed, but the guy is gone. But there's a leaflet on the table. It says, rally in Times Square to file the papers. And he's like, oh, shit. So he goes to Times Square in the center of Manhattan. There's a huge protest cage set up. And there's a bunch of people holding signs. And they're all chanting, file the papers, file the papers, file the papers. And, somebody gets up on the stage and they say, the fight for the Palestinians is the fight to file the papers. And everyone's like, yay. And the next person gets up. He said, the fight for transgender rights is also the fight to file the papers. And everyone's like, yay. And he goes up to the protest cage. And he says, what is wrong with you communists? I've just asked you guys to file the papers. The first guy wouldn't file the papers because he said he had to wait to defeat the Republicans. The next guy is trying to sell the papers to a bunch of people. And now you're having this stupid rally chanting file the papers and talking about Palestine. And what in the world is going on here? And that third guy gets very indignant. He says, how dare you compare me to those other groups? How dare you compare me to those other groups? Those other groups, they just talked about filing the papers. But my group, I actually did something. That's the state of the American Communist movement. File the papers, folks. File the papers. Build a base area. Get out of the movement. Get to the masses. They're all doing something else. They're all doing something else. Sad state of affairs. I've told that joke for years. It's not funny. It's actually kind of sad. Oh, boy. Okay, so, all right. Why not a Vanguard party? I already answered that question. All right. Well, actually, I didn't. So, yes, when something serious comes along, you know, there may come a time where a real Vanguard can be formed, but announcing a Vanguard right now is just kind of silly. I think we need to change people's consciousness. I think that there is an ideological problem and that we need to re-examine this, and we need socialist populism. You know, the way the left is moving currently is not going to work. So, there you go. Stone Mountain, Georgia, right? Well, a lot of people don't know that the Ku Klux Klan was revived in Stone Mountain, Georgia, right? After the movie The Birth of a Nation was made, the second Ku Klux Klan was revived in Stone Mountain, Georgia. You know, the Ku Klux Klan was originally in Tennessee, and it was armed resistance to Reconstruction, right? After the Civil War, there was Reconstruction in the U.S. South. There was an effort to allow black people to vote and be part of the government. And so, you know, the pro-Confederate elements led by Nathan Bedford Forrest, they formed the Ku Klux Klan to fight against black people voting and to wage violence and terror against black people during Reconstruction. Federal troops were sent to the South by Ulysses S. Grant to crush the Ku Klux Klan. It was after the movie The Birth of a Nation, the Hollywood movie, was screened, that in Stone Mountain, Georgia, there was a mass rally formed where they refounded the KKK. So Stone Mountain, Georgia has particular meaning to fascists and white supremacists. It's you know, the birthplace of the revived Ku Klux Klan. And the fact that there was a mobilization of people to defend themselves from, you know, Stone Mountain, Georgia, from some fascist revival. I support people's right to defend themselves. So there you go. Yeah. It's funny. For some reason, I'm not seeing any chats. All of a sudden, chats stopped appearing. So it's been a wild night. But hey, what the heck? So I'm just going to keep going. Yeah. And, you know, that's what happened. So, yeah, the fact that people mobilized against the Ku Klux Klan and had armed self-defense, I mean, you know, people have the right to defend themselves, right? You know, and there's no reason people shouldn't mobilize to counter fascist hate. So I'm not seeing any chats. No chats are going by. I don't know why it stopped, so that's weird. But I'm kind of at the end of my rope here. So on that note, I'm going to wrap things up. Folks, we need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. On that note, folks, have a good evening.